So today, to talk about this case, we're going offbeat with Mark Clifford, a journalist who worked closely with Lai in the Apple Daily's final days, and who's now the president of the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong. So welcome to the podcast, Mark.
Thanks, Amy.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us. Okay, so first of all, first question, why has the government chosen to make an example out of Jimmy Lai?
That's a great question to start with. I think Jimmy has something that, or a combination of three things which really frighten the Chinese communist leaders. First of all, he's rich. He's got resources. Second of all, he had a media platform, so he had a megaphone. And I think we all know how much the communist parties in general, Chinese communists in particular, fear media because they see it as a way of shaping public opinion. And third, he's got principles. His Catholic faith underpins so much of what he does. So this combination of money, media, and a deep spiritual faith, principles that he's willing to die for, just making someone that the Chinese Communist Party is determined to silence. The fact, of course, that he had millions of readers of his newspapers and magazines in Hong Kong and Taiwan, and that he had an avowedly free market, pro-democracy agenda further unnerved the Chinese. He's a really effective communicator. He's a kind of opponent that they haven't really run across before.
So can you tell us, why is Jimmy representing himself in his trial?
Well, he does have local lawyers, but he has chosen to speak because I think he wants the world to hear what he has to say. It's the same message. I've known him since the early 1990s. As you alluded to, I was on the board of Next Digital, the media company that published Apple Daily and Next Magazine. And he's always, pretty much from the first time I met him in 1993, been singing the same tune, which is Hong Kong is a place of freedom. It's a place of rule of law, free speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of worship, and the Chinese promised that was going to continue, and Jimmy wants to hold them to their promise. And I think what he wants to do is show the world that he is a man of nonviolence, but who believes in freedom, and he's willing to sacrifice his freedom for the freedom of Hong Kongers and others.
Yeah, I'd like to talk more about that. So it would have been so easy for him to kind of just fall in line with what the authorities were telling him to do and just keep making lots of money with his media companies. So why did he choose the hard route? Why would he choose to be defiant to the authorities and cause all this trouble for himself?
Well, coincidentally, I have a book coming out in 2 weeks, a biography of him, and it's called The Troublemaker, because it's his own words. He calls himself a troublemaker. I mean, he's a stubborn guy. He's an iconoclastic guy. He's a maverick. I mean, he was an entrepreneur in the clothing business with Giordano and manufacturing clothing for decades before he got into politics. So it's kind of just who he is. He doesn't like being pushed around. I mean, he was an immigrant. He came at the age of 12, escaping famine in China, worked his way up from living in a factory to quickly owning a factory. And he just really believes in freedom. That first time I met him in 1993, I just moved to Hong Kong a little more than a year earlier. And he talked to me about why he was going to start a newspaper. And honestly speaking, it sounded a little well, let's just say ambitious to me. But he knew that everybody else was withdrawing in terms of confronting China, all the other media owners. So he looked at it as a business. Of course, he really believed in democracy, believed in freedom, was really galvanized by the 1989 Tiananmen protests. But he realized that he had a business opportunity. And then once he got into it and he saw the reaction of the millions of Hong Kong supporters, readers, people who came out in the streets in 2003, 2014 umbrella movement, in 2019, he kind of unwittingly emerged as a leader. He never wanted political power, but he did want to speak truth to power.
Okay, I've heard that this trial that he's currently embroiled in is it's been described as a sham trial. So what do you expect? Do you agree with that, first of all? And second, what do you expect the outcome of this trial to be?
Yeah, I think it's a sham trial, a show trial. To call it a kangaroo court, I think would be a slur on kangaroos. He's gonna be guilty. I mean, it's just, it's a foregone conclusion. He is seen by the leaders in Beijing, all the way to the very top, to Xi Jinping. He's seen as the mastermind, the black hand of the protests in Hong Kong. It was almost as if the national security law that he's being tried under was written for Jimmy Lai, to get Jimmy Lai. So I, of course, expect a guilty verdict, and I expect a lengthy sentence. For a guy who's 76 years old, it's tantamount to a death sentence unless the international campaign to free him is successful, which I think it will be.
Should he be convicted, what would that then say about press freedoms in Hong Kong?
Well, I think we know where press freedom stands in Hong Kong, which is it's a thing of the past. It's receding into the rearview mirror. I was on the board of directors, luckily not in Hong Kong, the second time that they raided Apple Daily, sent 500 police in, rounded up a number of our employees, 6 of whom, besides Jimmy Lai, are still in jail, even though they've pled guilty, being held hostage. I mean, there's no more press freedom in Hong Kong. You can be mildly critical around the edges, perhaps, but press freedom is no more, sadly.
So Apple Daily is openly engaged in political activism, and I think one word that always pops up in describing its reporting was irreverent. So it was on Beijing's radar far before its forced closure. Was what happened next digital shuttering and the company's executives being arrested always a possibility to leadership, or does it go beyond what you imagine that the future of press freedom in Hong Kong might look like?
No, what happened was so much worse than any of us imagined. I think that Jimmy and others knew that Beijing was going to continue to pressure the publications, but the thought that you'd have 500 police come in and just basically cart away computers and press materials, and eventually a few weeks or a few months later, just take away everything, just strip the building, take a listed public company listed on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange and essentially steal it from its shareholders by freezing bank accounts, making it impossible for us to even accept payments from our 600,000 digital subscribers. I mean, all this was beyond imagination. And if you told me 5 years ago that Jimmy Lai would have been sitting in jail in solitary confinement for more than 1,400 days it's coming up on 4 years now, I would have thought that you were nuts. I mean, it's so far beyond anyone's imagination that it's hard to describe. And I think, we're all still in shock, even though it's been 4 years since the national security law came in, and since, a few months after that Jimmy was jailed. On the other hand, Jimmy has been a long-standing critic of Beijing. As far back as 1994, he wrote a piece, I think quite correctly, attacking then Premier Li Peng, who was regarded as the butcher of Beijing for his role in killing hundreds, perhaps thousands of Chinese civilians in June 1989. So, on the one hand, Jimmy and his team have been pressing, as you say, they were irreverent. Not sure I would necessarily say it was an activist newspaper, but certainly Apple and Next were, very, I guess, sympathetic in many cases to the movement that was going on. Not uncritically so. They clearly weren't pro-independence for Hong Kong. They definitely were espousing nonviolence. But this was not a middle of the road neutral newspaper.
Okay. Now I want to go back into press freedom. I think we moved away from that a little bit too quickly. What would have to happen for Hong Kong to regain its press freedom? And is there any hope at all, in your opinion?
Yeah, well, I think there's hope, but I mean, I think you'd have to see a wholesale change, not only in Hong Kong leadership, but in the Chinese leadership. It's hard to imagine under anything that we've seen under the Chinese Communist Party for the last 75 years that Hong Kong could once again enjoy press freedom. It's really sad because it's so easy to destroy freedoms, to take them away, to shut newspapers, and it's so hard to nurture press freedom to nurture the kind of open discourse and discussion that press freedom requires. We did see it for a brief period of time in the spring of 1989 in mainland China itself. But in Hong Kong's case, press freedom had developed over the, in fits and starts, but over 156 years of British colonialism. And then for much of the first 20 years of Chinese rule, after 1997. But again, it's not like a light switch. It's not like you can just turn on if we had a, it's unlikely, but if there were a wholesale change in government, it's not like Apple Daily can just start again tomorrow. I mean, and we had thousands of staff. They've scattered, around the world into other professions. We had printing presses. We had buildings. I mean, all that was stolen from us. And Apple, of course, and Next were, of course, the largest, but they weren't the only truly independent press. I mean, you had things like Stand News, which have also been shut down, and some of its key people jailed. So, it's easier to wreck something like press freedom than to see it grow. It just doesn't grow quickly. I am convinced, though, that most Hong Kong people support democracy. 6 out of 10 Hong Kong people always voted for pro-democracy candidates from the first open territory-wide elections in 1991 until the district council elections in 2019. I mean, there's a clear majority, always over 50% of people voting for pro-democracy candidates. And I think if Hong Kong were free again, that DNA, that element of Hong Kong would reassert itself, and you would see press freedom and an open press springing up again.
Okay. Moving along, one of the aims of the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong is to defend political prisoners, such as Jimmy Lai. Could you tell us some of the ways that your organization is working towards that cause and how people like our listeners could help?
Sure. Well, first of all, let's look at the numbers. In the last 5 years, more than 1,900 Hong Kongers have been put in prison, convicted and imprisoned on political charges. Another 7,000 or so still have charges hanging over them from the 2019 period. So the numbers are large. We've focused on a handful of high priority or kind of well-known political prisoners. Jimmy Lai, of course, is the best known. But, there are others, Chow Hang Tung, Lee Chuk Yen, Gwyneth Ho, Joshua Wong. I mean, the list, there are a lot of people, and we need to try to remember all of them. We're very active. We're based in the U.S. We're active especially in Washington, D.C. and in London, in the U.K. We have primarily worked through the legislative process and with the governments as well, trying to build international support to hold China accountable, to make it pay a price, Hong Kong and China and its leaders to pay a price for the way in which they've broken China's promises to Hong Kong, that it would have a high degree of autonomy for 50 years. So, we do everything that activists tend to do: work through the legislative process, work talking to government officials, writing articles, doing media appearances. We also do non-conventional things. We've done a number of large-scale wall projections using drones and other photography on iconic buildings, everywhere from the Tower of London to the Guggenheim Museum to the Department of Energy to the Chinese Embassy in Washington. Because Hong Kong is, relatively speaking, a small place. It's halfway around the world from the east coast of America or from London, and it's a big world out there. There are a lot of problems, and we want to keep shining a spotlight on Hong Kong and on the Hong Kong and Chinese leaders who have broken their promises to the people of Hong Kong. I think that we shouldn't forget the people of Hong Kong and the fact that it is still a somewhat more open city than the mainland. We don't want to punish Hong Kongers, most of whom do support democracy, do support a more open society. And we want to do everything we can to ameliorate the conditions, particularly of political prisoners, and to start getting these prisoners out. And anything that your listeners can do to help in that regard and to just keep the focus on Hong Kong, I think everybody in Hong Kong would welcome.
Okay, so when you say you don't want to punish Hong Kongers, there are some people who suggest that maybe we should put sanctions on Hong Kong because of what's going on there, and I guess that would be one way to indirectly punish them. Were you referring to that, or did you mean something else?
That's a great question, Eugene. Our group has supported sanctions for individuals, like let's say John Lee, chief executive. But I don't think there's any attempt to kind of punish Hong Kong as a whole or treat it as a pariah. I do think that the international business community needs to take a harder look at the nefarious role that Hong Kong increasingly is playing in laundering money for bad regimes, whether it be North Korea or Russia or Myanmar or Iran, and also the way in which high-value technology is being smuggled through Hong Kong and is being used most notably in the Russian war effort in Ukraine. So, yeah, we'd like to punish Hong Kong companies, and to the extent that it's appropriate, the Hong Kong government for their role in undermining the international order. But we don't have any intention, quite the contrary, of doing anything that would hurt the great majority of Hong Kong people.
So I guess it's very complex and nuanced as everything seems to be in that part of the world. So thank you very much for appearing on RFA Insider, and we will be in contact with you in the future, and we appreciate it.
Yeah, it was great talking to you, Mark.
Thank you very much.
Great talking to you. Thanks very much.